The night my own son stood in front of a room full of strangers and told me to apologize or leave his house, something inside me cracked in a way that would never quite mend the same again. It was not the humiliation that burned most, but the realization that a single sentence could redraw the entire map of a family. One moment I was a mother at a gathering, the next I was an outsider in a life I helped build. And as the room fell silent, I understood that sometimes the deepest wounds come from the hands we once held closest. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you have not already, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Margaret Hayes, and at 62 years old, I have grown used to the quiet rhythm of my small life on the coast of Portland, Maine. Most mornings I wake before the sun rises, when the air still carries the cool scent of the Atlantic. I brew my coffee, open the kitchen window, and listen to the gulls circling above the harbor. My house is modest, a weathered clapboard cottage with creaking floors and a garden of herbs that I tend with patient hands. I once taught cooking classes at the community center, and although I am retired now, I still host small lessons for seniors who enjoy the company as much as the recipes. Life has been gentle but lonely since my husband passed. I keep his photographs on the mantle and find comfort in the familiar routine of my days. Still, my thoughts often drift westward to my son Andrew, who left Maine years ago for a world I do not fully understand. He was a curious, warm boy, always tinkering with tools and asking questions about everything. Now he works in technology in Palo Alto, and his calls have grown shorter over time, filled with things I pretend to understand but rarely do. I miss the boy who used to run down the beach with salt in his hair. My daughter-in-law, Veronica Hale, belongs to a completely different world. She was raised in Pacific Heights and carries herself with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to curated perfection. I try to see the good in her, but I always feel like a guest in her presence, as though she is measuring my every gesture. When Andrew invited me to attend a charity event they were hosting, I accepted with hope, but also with a knot of unease. I wanted to see him. I wanted to believe the distance between us was not as wide as it felt. Packing for the trip took longer than it should have. I folded my simple blouses and long skirts, then hesitated, wondering if they would seem plain next to the polished elegance of California society. Still, I added a jar of my homemade blueberry jam and a hand-stitched apron as a gift. During the flight, surrounded by business travelers with sleek laptops and expensive headphones, I wondered whether my presence would be a comfort or an inconvenience. The contrast hit me the moment I arrived in Palo Alto. The air felt warmer, the streets cleaner, the houses larger than anything I had known. As the car carried me through the neighborhoods, lined with stately trees and shimmering pools, I felt as if I were gliding through a magazine spread. When we stopped in front of Andrew and Veronica's house, I hesitated before stepping out. The mansion rose behind iron gates, lit by soft amber lights that made the windows glow like polished glass. Inside, the floors gleamed, and the walls were lined with modern art. Staff moved briskly, preparing for the evening's event. I felt suddenly aware of my simple shoes and my travel-creased blouse. Andrew greeted me with a quick smile, warm but distracted, and then hurried off to handle more preparations. I watched him disappear down a hallway and felt a pang of loss, as though I were looking at a stranger wearing my son's face. Left alone, I studied the framed photographs arranged on the walls. They showed trips to Italy, wine tastings in Napa Valley, and parties filled with elegant people I had never met. I did not appear in a single one. The house felt beautiful but cold, more like a showroom than a home. When I finally settled into the guest room, I opened the curtains and watched the California dusk spread over the yard. I had hoped this visit would draw us closer, yet even in the quiet of that room I could sense a distance growing. I told myself to be patient, to stay gentle, and to carry myself with the dignity my husband once admired. I did not yet know how deeply the night ahead would test me. If you're still watching and this moment hit you the way it hit me, comment number 1 below so I know you're still here with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. I stepped out of the guest room feeling like someone had quietly placed a stone in my stomach. The charity event had already begun to swell through the house. Soft music drifted from hidden speakers, and clusters of guests mingled under the warm glow of chandeliers. The scent of roasted vegetables and fresh herbs floated from the kitchen, where the private chef worked with quick, confident movements. Everywhere I looked, people seemed perfectly at ease, dressed in elegant fabrics that shimmered when they turned their heads. I stood at the edge of the foyer, trying to blend in without seeming lost. Veronica appeared at the top of the stairs, radiant in a deep emerald gown that hugged her like it had been made for her alone. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, greeting each person with a warm, polished smile. Her voice carried easily as she began guiding a small group through the house. I followed at a distance, not wanting to intrude, yet feeling obligated to show interest. She showed the guests the Italian-designed kitchen, the custom dining table carved from reclaimed wood, and the glass-walled wine room filled with bottles arranged like art. Each item came with a story about where it had been found, who had recommended it, or why it was considered rare. It all sounded rehearsed, but the guests listened with fascination. As I trailed behind, I could not help feeling out of place. Conversations flowed effortlessly around me, filled with the references to venture capital rounds, software acquisitions, private schools, and European travel. I nodded and smiled politely whenever someone glanced my way, though I rarely understood the context of the discussion. It reminded me of being the quiet student in a classroom where everyone else already had the answers. Veronica eventually stopped before a round glass table in the living room. At the center sat a tall ceramic vase with painted vines curling around the surface. She lifted a hand with a delicate gesture and announced that the vase was a rare piece won at a private auction in Napa Valley. The guests leaned in, admiring it from several angles, letting out appreciative hums. Even Andrew seemed proud as he stood beside his wife, watching her command the room. When I looked at the vase, something familiar tugged at me. The pattern reminded me of a stall in a small antique market in Maine, the same one I used to visit with Andrew when he was young. Without thinking, I spoke. I said that the vase looked remarkably similar to one I had seen in a local antique market back home. My voice was gentle, almost nostalgic, but the effect was immediate. The room went still for a moment, as though I had spoken out of turn. Veronica's smile remained, but it lost all warmth. She calmly explained that the vase was an exclusive item, the kind not found in small-town shops. Her tone was polite, but I felt the sting beneath it. Several guests glanced between us, unsure whether to react. Andrew shifted his weight and looked away, pretending to check something on his watch. The air felt heavier after that, as if everyone had silently agreed to step around me. I stood there wishing I could pull the words back into my throat. I had not meant to embarrass anyone. I had not even thought of embarrassment. I had spoken from memory, not judgment. But in this house, even harmless observations seemed to have consequences. I drifted toward a window, staring out at the perfectly trimmed hedges, wondering how a simple comment could create such tension. As the evening continued, Veronica flowed back into her hosting role, but something between us had shifted. I felt it every time her eyes slid past me, as though I were a misplaced object. The more the guests laughed and mingled, the more I felt myself shrinking inside my own skin. This was not my world, and I sensed that tonight was only the beginning of a deeper unraveling. If you're following the story and feeling the tension build, comment number 2 below to let me know you're staying with me. Now, let's step into Chapter 3. When the last of the guests drifted out through the glowing doorway, the house finally exhaled. The music had faded, the soft sparkle of conversation had collapsed into silence, and only the lingering scent of roasted fennel and citrus remained in the air. I stood near the edge of the kitchen island, unsure of where to place myself. Veronica spoke quietly with 2 staff members as they cleared glasses, her face composed yet strained. I could sense an invisible wall around her, one I did not dare approach. The weight of the evening pressed heavily on my chest, a silent reminder that I did not belong in this world of polished surfaces and careful smiles. Andrew moved through the living room, thanking the final guest with a tone that felt overly rehearsed. When he finally caught my eyes, his expression tightened in a way that made my stomach sink. He did not speak. He simply tilted his head toward the hallway, the gesture sharp and unmistakable. I followed him past the framed photographs and down the long corridor, my footsteps small against the smooth floor. For a moment, I felt like a child being summoned for a reprimand, even though I carried decades of life behind me. His office was bright and oversized, a contrast to the cozy, cluttered workspace he had once kept during his college years. Screens glowed on the desk, and shelves displayed books about leadership, innovation, and strategic thinking. Nothing looked worn or personal. It was a room designed for efficiency, not comfort. I stood near the chair but did not sit. The space demanded formality, and Andrew seemed to stand taller inside it. He turned toward me, shoulders squared, jaw locked into place. His voice began with calm precision, but beneath it, I sensed a tension that bordered on anger. He told me that Veronica had been deeply hurt by my comment about the vase. He said that I had embarrassed her in front of important people, and that the remark had jeopardized the entire tone of the evening. Each word fell with a weight that did not match the small, harmless memory I had shared. I tried to explain. I told him softly that I had meant no insult, that the vase reminded me of the days when he and I wandered through the main antique market together. I hoped the memory would soften him, would remind him of the simple world we once shared. Instead, he cut me off with a firmness that startled me. He insisted that this was not about memories or sentiment, but about understanding how the upper social circles operated. He spoke as if he were delivering instructions, not speaking to his mother. Then he said the words that sliced through me with a clean, cold edge. He told me to apologize to Veronica or leave his house. There was no tremble in his voice, no hesitation, only certainty. The room felt suddenly smaller, as though the walls had leaned inward to witness my humiliation. I stared at him, searching for the boy who used to run along the shoreline calling my name, the boy who once clung to my hand. Instead, I saw a man shaped by a world that prized image over affection. A dull ache spread through my chest. I wondered whether I had misstepped so badly or if something much deeper had shifted inside my son long before this evening. I tried to steady my breathing, to keep myself from shattering in front of him. I told him I would apologize, but the words came with a quiet resolve. I needed to understand what was happening beneath the surface of this perfect house. Andrew exhaled sharply, relieved yet still guarded, as if he feared I might change my mind. I stepped past him and left the office, moving slowly down the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. I knew that what happened tonight was not the end of a conflict, but the beginning of something larger and far more painful. The house around me glittered with luxury, yet all I felt was an emptiness echoing through its halls. If you're still watching and you can feel the cracks forming beneath the surface, comment number 3 below so I know you're right here beside me. Now let's move into chapter 4. I stood alone in the hallway after Andrew's words had settled like cold ash at my feet. The house was quiet here, insulated from the chatter drifting out of the dining room. I pressed my palm against the wall, letting the cool paint steady me. For a moment, I simply breathed, trying to gather the pieces of myself that had scattered under the pressure of my son's demand. I did not want anyone to see the flicker of hurt behind my ribs, so I stayed where the shadows softened everything. When my breath finally evened out, I straightened my shoulders and walked toward the guest restroom to compose myself. My reflection stared back at me, a woman trying very hard not to crumble. I smoothed the front of my dress, adjusted the clasp on my bracelet, and lifted my chin. If I was going to step back into that room, I wanted to do it with dignity and tact. I repeated a quiet reminder in my mind, a rhythm I had relied on many times before. Hold steady, hold steady. The noise in the dining room had shifted. The easy laughter was gone, replaced with hushed tones and sympathetic hums circling around Veronica like moths drawn to a candle. She sat near the end of the table, holding a napkin to her cheek with a delicacy that looked rehearsed. Her friends leaned in close, their faces pulled into tight masks of concern. Every so often their eyes flicked toward me, as though I were a disruptive headline they could not stop rereading. I watched from a distance, letting myself take in the scene. Veronica looked fragile, in a way that did not match her usual polished confidence. Something about it felt performative, yet I could not deny the effect it had on the room. Andrew hovered near her, wringing his hands, trapped between wanting to comfort his wife and managing his discomfort about what he had said to me earlier. I could see the tension in every gesture. I needed a moment more before stepping into the center of their judgment, so I drifted toward the corridor near his home office. The door was open slightly, and I paused instinctively. I did not intend to spy, but the sliver of light revealed something that made me still. On the desk lay a large envelope stamped with the seal of a federal financial agency. The words printed across the top were impossible to misread. Notice of asset freeze pending investigation. Under it, my son's full name sat heavy and unavoidable. I did not touch the envelope, yet it felt like it burned through the air toward me. A realization pricked the back of my neck. The lavish house, the expensive renovations, the strained look Andrew had carried for months, the fierce need to impress Veronica's friends, the fragility behind every decision. Something was crumbling beneath the surface, something deeper than a comment about wine. Unease threaded its way through my chest. The life Andrew had built, the image he had clung to so desperately, might not be as solid as it appeared. I stepped back from the door, letting it drift nearly closed again, and took a slow breath. Whatever trouble he was in, he had kept it from me, maybe from everyone. With that new weight on my mind, I returned to the dining room. Every step felt different now, not because of the apology waiting for me, but because I saw the entire room in a new light. The chandeliers, the imported decor, the immaculate table setting, the forced calm of the guests. It all felt like a stage. I stopped near the entryway and watched Veronica dab at her eyes again. She was waiting for me to approach, expecting my humiliation to seal her victory. But something inside me had shifted. I knew I would apologize, but not in the way she imagined. My words would not be submission. They would be a door, one I intended to use to understand the truth behind all this glitter and fear. I inhaled, gathered my resolve, and stepped forward, ready to speak on my own terms. If you're still watching and sensing that deeper trouble is on the horizon, comment number 4 below to show you're staying with the journey. Now, let's turn to chapter 5. The living room had transformed into a crowded stage, though no one seemed sure what role they were supposed to play. Guests drifted back in with their refilled glasses, forming loose circles of conversation that felt more like small islands bracing for a storm. The chandelier above us scattered its light against rows of crystal, turning every surface into something sharp and glittering. Someone near the piano had just finished playing Autumn Leaves, and the last note still hung in the air like a breath that had not been released. It was almost too peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes tension more obvious, not less. I felt the weight of every eye on me when I pushed my chair back. The sound was not loud, but in that moment it might as well have been a crack of thunder. I rose slowly, steadying myself in a room that had become foreign despite its beauty. I did not want to tremble, so I pressed my hands together for one brief second before letting them fall calmly at my sides. The conversations around me thinned, softened, and then died altogether. I spoke clearly, allowing my voice to carry without force. I told Veronica that if my earlier remark had caused her pain, I apologized. A ripple moved through the room, the kind that suggests everyone believes the conflict has ended. A few shoulders relaxed. One guest gave a small nod as though satisfied, but I had not finished, and they all sensed it the moment I paused longer than politeness required. I let that silence settle fully before adding the words that had been building inside my chest. I apologized because I had believed this house, this gathering, this family space still allowed room for people to be imperfect and still be loved. My voice did not break, but the truth inside it struck through the glitter of the evening with enough force to still even the most restless guest. A chair shifted. Someone coughed lightly. Dozens of eyes rose toward me as though pulled. I spoke about the kitchens I knew, the ones with pans that carried the mark of many meals, and about dinners that were sometimes too salty but full of laughter. I spoke about memories instead of labels, warmth instead of performance. These images felt almost out of place among the pristine marble and the carefully curated decor, and perhaps that was why they landed so heavily. The contrast revealed everything we had been pretending not to see. Veronica answered with a kind of cold precision that felt almost rehearsed. She told me that my story belonged to me and not to them, her emphasis on the words drawing a line across the room. She might as well have erected a fence between those she considered hers and those she did not. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the steel beneath her composure. I looked at Andrew then. In the quiet, I told him that fear of losing him was stronger than fear of losing dignity. His shoulders tensed, as though my honesty had pierced something he had managed to keep hidden. Several guests who had been recording with their phones slowly lowered them, recognizing this was not entertainment, but a wound opening in real time. I bowed my head slightly toward Veronica. I apologized again, though not in the way she had hoped. I admitted that I did not know how to exist in her world, but I prayed that my son would not lose himself trying to survive within it. The words were simple, but they were not small. They carried years of worry, disappointment, and hope. The room erupted into whispers. Some guests leaned into each other, stunned. Others stared at Veronica, waiting to see how she would respond now that her veneer had cracked. The glittering room that had felt like a showcase moments ago now felt like a battleground, each person waiting for the next blow. The night had changed course irreversibly. No one there could pretend otherwise. The room had not recovered from what happened earlier, even with the music paused and the guests attempting to return to their conversations. The air felt heavy, as if every chandelier crystal absorbed the tension and refused to release it. People stood in small clusters, their glasses held mid-chest, untouched. They watched each other carefully, waiting for signs of which direction the night would tilt. Nothing about the space felt warm anymore. It felt like the calm that comes when people are too afraid to speak. Veronica rose suddenly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. Her shoulders trembled as she lifted a hand to her face. Tears spilled quickly, but they did not soften the sharpness in her expression. She declared that I was envious of the life she and Andrew had built. Her voice rose higher with each word, creating ripples through the guests. A few individuals nodded without conviction, choosing agreement simply because it seemed the safest option. Others kept their eyes fixed on the ground, startled by the accusation and unwilling to be pulled into her narrative. The accusation lingered between us like smoke. I looked at Andrew and saw him caught in the center of a storm he had not anticipated. He stepped toward me, then hesitated, his foot shifting backward toward Veronica. He looked like a man trying to move in two directions at once. The conflict carved itself into his face. His loyalty was being tugged by two separate worlds, and he could not seem to decide which one held him more firmly. Watching his indecision scraped at something deep inside me. I turned away, not out of defeat, but out of clarity. Leaving felt like the only way to free him from a choice he was not ready to make. I imagined myself walking out the front door, stepping into the night with only the echo of my own footsteps for company. I thought about calling a car, sliding into the back seat, and letting the silence swallow everything. It felt lonely, but it also felt merciful, as though I could shield Andrew from tearing himself in half. Before I could reach the hallway, a calm voice cut through the din. A man who had remained quiet until now stepped forward. He was older, a seasoned investor from Menlo Park, whom many in the room respected. His presence alone commanded attention, and when he spoke, the entire living room froze. He said that I was not jealous, not in the slightest. His words were steady, delivered with the assurance of someone who had nothing to gain from taking sides. Then he revealed what no one expected. He explained that Veronica had once persuaded him to purchase an item at a charity auction, insisting it was a rare collectible. He later discovered the certificate of authenticity had been digitally altered. The transaction had been routed through a newly created charitable foundation, raising even more suspicion. He had stayed silent out of courtesy to her family, but watching the scene unfold tonight pushed him past his limit. Gasps filled the room. A woman covered her mouth. A man nearly dropped his glass. It was as if a fragile surface had shattered all at once, sending glittering pieces across the floor. The guests whispered rapidly, their earlier restraint dissolving into shock. Even the stillness of the house seemed to crack as truth moved through it. Andrew turned to Veronica with a stunned expression. His face shifted through several emotions in quick succession. Disbelief, hurt, recognition. It was the look of someone who realized that the doubts he had buried were not illusions after all. The carefully painted versions of events he had accepted were peeling apart right in front of him. Veronica insisted she had relied on an employee, then tried to blame a partner, then suggested it was an honest mistake. Her eyes darted toward the doorways, as if she were hunting for an escape route. None of her explanations held steady. Her sobbing no longer resembled sorrow, but rather fear that her carefully guarded image was slipping beyond her reach. I stood quietly, one hand over my chest, grounding myself against the swirl of chaos. I counted my breaths and let the truth settle around us without adding to it. The moment did not feel triumphant. It simply felt real. And reality, when it arrives, rarely dresses itself in comfort or beauty. It comes plain, unavoidable, and clarifying. By the time the murmurs filled every corner of the room, the image Veronica had built for so long had begun to crumble. The bridge she relied on, constructed from perception and performance, fractured under the weight of a truth spoken aloud. The choice now stood before Andrew, no longer hidden behind appearances, and for the first time, he could finally see what lay on either side. If you're still watching and that twist shook you the way it shook me, comment number 6 below so I know you're holding on. Now, let's move toward Chapter 7. Morning arrived with the kind of sharp clarity that follows a storm. The sunlight over Palo Alto seemed too bright for the heaviness that had taken root in the night. I sat alone in a small hotel room on University Avenue, a place chosen for its anonymity rather than comfort. The muted hum of cars outside the window blended with the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. My phone buzzed every few minutes. Messages from acquaintances, distant relatives, and even people I barely knew filled the screen. Rumors had traveled faster than the smell of the coffee brewing downstairs. Tech groups were already discussing what they called the explosion in old Palo Alto, trading theories as though it were a dramatic case study rather than our life unraveling. The knock on my door was soft, not tentative, but tired. When I opened it, Andrew stood there with dark circles under his eyes. His shoulders slumped forward, as if the weight of everything had shifted to his bones overnight. He held a paper cup of coffee, though his hands trembled too much for him to drink it. He stepped inside without saying anything, and for a moment, we simply breathed the same heavy air. He began speaking in fragments, his voice strained. He told me the company was under investigation for inflating numbers before a funding round. The practice began as an adjustment he assumed could be corrected with future growth. But pressure from Veronica and her family had pushed those adjustments into falsehood. Veronica demanded that the metrics reflect what she believed a successful company should look like, not what it truly was. Her family had their own expectations, and Andrew felt trapped beneath a tower of standards that was impossible to meet. He explained how he had borrowed money to cover the gaps in their finances. It was meant to be temporary, he said, an attempt to keep the appearance of success intact until things improved. But nothing improved. The circle tightened instead, binding him to decisions he no longer recognized as his own. His voice faltered when he described the fear of disappointing them, the fear of not being enough, the fear of losing what he thought he needed to protect. The Hale family reacted swiftly when news of the investigation reached them. Their silence was immediate and complete. They cut communication, advising him through intermediaries to stay quiet and let attorneys handle everything. People who had clinked glasses with him the night before no longer answered calls. Their sudden distance revealed how conditional their loyalty had always been. I told him that no beautiful lie could save him. Only the truth could. The words came gently, without blame, shaped by years of knowing how people lose themselves trying to live up to worlds that do not belong to them. He lowered his head then, and tears spilled down his face. I had not seen him cry since his father's funeral. This time the grief was not for someone lost, but for parts of himself he had surrendered without noticing. I held him, remembering the small boy who clung to me after falling off his bicycle, scraped and shaken but determined to stand again. The memory wrapped itself around us like a blanket. He whispered that he feared disappointing me more than anything else. I told him disappointment was not the same as abandonment. We decided to return to Maine, not to run away, but to breathe. Maine held the kind of quiet that allowed thoughts to settle and people to see themselves clearly. We needed that clarity before facing the legal storm that awaited him. The old house welcomed us with its familiar creaks and drafts. Andrew repaired the leaky faucet, replaced the door of a cabinet he had broken as a teenager, and relearned simple rhythms of living. He practiced steaming kale and cutting vegetables, gestures small enough to calm a frayed mind. In the community cooking class for older adults, he spoke openly for the first time. The truth came out of him slowly, without embellishment. No one applauded him. Instead, an older man placed a hand on Andrew's shoulder. The gesture was neither pity nor admiration. It was forgiveness, freely given, and for the first time in months, my son exhaled without fear. Returning to Maine felt like stepping into a world made of slower breath. The drive from the airport passed through long stretches of pine forest, the trees bending slightly in the winter wind, as if bowing in quiet understanding. Andrew sat beside me, looking out the window with an expression that hovered between exhaustion and relief. The silence in the car was not heavy the way it had been in California. It felt like a soft space where thoughts could settle without being chased. By the time we reached the old house, the air smelled of sea salt and cold bark, a scent that had always grounded me. Andrew stood at the doorway for a long moment, as if absorbing the permission to rest. The kitchen was the first place he gravitated toward, maybe because it held so many memories of simpler years, or maybe because rebuilding something tangible felt safer than facing the abstract weight of consequences. He began by fixing the leak under the sink, tightening the pipes with clumsy hands that had spent too long typing instead of repairing. Then he replaced the cabinet door that had hung crooked ever since he slammed it as a teenager. He sanded the rough corners of the counter and scrubbed stains from the old wooden boards. Every small repair steadied him. Watching him, I realized that healing often begins not with epiphanies, but with the sound of a screwdriver turning into place. I continued teaching cooking classes at the community center, and Andrew joined without being asked. At first, he stayed near the back, arranging cutting boards and wiping tables. Gradually, he moved closer, handing out ingredients, explaining small steps, discovering a rhythm that had nothing to do with investors or deadlines. The elderly group welcomed him with gentle humor and questions that expected no performance. Their stories, layered with the decades of failures and recoveries, offered a kind of wisdom he desperately needed. In their presence, he learned to speak honestly, even if only about the texture of dough or the patience required for simmering broth. The slow days created a mirror he had avoided for years. He walked along the shoreline in the mornings, letting the ocean's icy breath clear the fog inside him. Evenings were spent at the kitchen table, thinking out loud about what he feared and what he hoped. I urged him to meet the investigation with truth, not excuses. I told him honesty was not surrender, but reclamation. He listened, not defensively, but with the quiet hunger of someone ready to shed a skin that no longer fit. The peace did not last. One gray afternoon, a car pulled into the driveway, its engine breaking the quiet like a misplaced note. When the door opened and Veronica stepped out, the air around us tightened. She looked out of place against the weathered wood of the porch, as if the landscape itself refused to soften her edges. She came not with remorse, but with a request that revealed the sharpness beneath her charm. She asked Andrew to sign papers transferring all of his shares, insisting it would protect her family from further investigation. Her tone carried an urgency that had nothing to do with concern for him. Andrew stood straighter than I had seen in months. He refused, simply and firmly. Veronica's mask cracked then. In the stiffening of her posture and the flicker of fear behind her eyes, I saw the truth she had worked so hard to hide. Without another word, she left, leaving behind a trail of cold air that drifted across the kitchen tiles long after her footsteps faded. Andrew exhaled slowly, as if releasing a long-held breath. Something unlatched inside him. The absence she left was not a wound, but an opening. And for the first time, he stepped into it without hesitation. If you're still here and ready to see how every choice begins to turn into consequence, comment number 8 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's head toward the final chapters. The morning the investigation ended, the air in Maine carried the kind of cold that made every breath feel clean. The notification arrived while I was pouring coffee, and I stood still for a long moment as the details settled in. Andrew would be fined and required to return a portion of the inflated profits, but he would not face criminal charges. Cooperation and honesty had carried him through. Relief came quietly, like a tide rolling in without sound, followed by the dull ache of knowing the damage could never be entirely undone. Andrew moved through the next days with a calm I had not seen in years. His marriage had shifted into a quiet separation, with Veronica drifting back toward the glittering world she always preferred. She stepped into new dinner parties and new circles, leaving the wreckage of the old ones behind her. Andrew did not chase her. Instead, he chose the steady rhythm of the coast, spending long afternoons down by Commercial Street, watching boats rise and fall with the tide. He surprised himself when he accepted a position teaching basic programming at the local community center. Once, he would have dismissed the job as beneath him, but now he found meaning in the small victories of each student learning a new skill. I started my Saturday seafood soup class again, and he became my volunteer helper. The older attendees teased him about peeling potatoes too slowly, and he took every joke with a smile that reached his eyes. Every evening, we walked along the path near Portland Head Light. The lighthouse stood unmoving, a reminder that steadiness mattered more than shine. We talked about choices, failures, and the strange mercy of starting over. Back in California, the gossip faded. Those who once clamored for attention fell silent as soon as the spectacle ended. One evening, Andrew called his former father-in-law and told him, with steady resolve, that he would be fine on his own terms. When we returned home, I slipped the old bank envelope into a drawer. It was no longer a burden, only a reminder. That night, over a simple meal, I looked at my son and finally saw the boy I had raised, no longer hiding behind anything at all. There are places in this world where an apology is nothing more than a lid pressed over a boiling pot, a tool meant to muffle the sound of truth rather than honor it. I learned that in California, where people apologize with perfect diction and empty eyes. But at home, in the quiet kitchens of Maine, an apology is a key. It opens the door to forgiveness, to warmth, to understanding. It is not meant to disguise anything. It is meant to connect. I spent many nights replaying that moment when my own son told me to say sorry or leave his house. For a mother, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to fall or push back against the wind. I chose to rise. I understood then that dignity often has no volume, but its silence can fill a room in a way fury never will. It was not rebellion. It was remembering who I was. Luxury had followed Veronica like a shadow, but I realized how easily such shadows could be borrowed. A dress, a bottle, a story about wealth, all of it can be worn like a costume, but dignity must be laid brick by brick, with honesty and effort and the willingness to face consequences. You cannot purchase it. You must become it. Money can bring antique pieces into a home, but it cannot buy memories shaped by real affection. It can pay for a grand dinner party, yet never replace the comfort of a simple shared meal. We fear losing face in front of strangers, forgetting that losing ourselves is far more dangerous. When masks fall, it is not our job to lift them back up. Let the truth breathe. Let the person behind the mask face their own reflection. Penalties and repayments may bruise pride, but they are not the final verdict. The true judgment comes from how a person walks forward afterward. Sometimes, returning to a place with salt in the air and worn cutting boards is the only way to start again. There, I remembered how to live slowly, speak honestly, and rebuild from the kitchen outward. Family is a road with two directions. If one direction is blocked, kindness can carve a new path around the rubble. And if the day comes when you must stand in front of a full room, rise. Calm is its own kind of courage. In the quiet that follows any storm, we are reminded that truth has a way of settling everything it touches. Pride can fracture even the strongest ties, yet humility can stitch together what once seemed beyond repair. Wealth may glow for a moment, but integrity is the flame that endures the wind. When the noise fades, what remains is the slow work of rebuilding a life built on honesty rather than performance, on presence rather than pretense. And sometimes, the greatest act of strength is simply choosing to stand steady in a room that expects you to bow. Thank you for staying with this story. If it stirred something in you, share your thoughts below. And if you want more stories that speak to the quiet battles of everyday people, feel free to follow, comment, and subscribe. Your voice matters, and this space is richer whenever you choose to stay.